Hello and welcome. My name is Pamela Gifford, and I'm a lifelong friend and collaborator of Lillian's. And I asked to introduce her tonight because I wanted to make sure the listeners here tonight knew the full scope of her work beyond writing and the artistic impact she's had and experience. In fact, the independent artisan press that she founded, 3 Arts Press, refers to the 3 arts with which Lillian has had extensive involvement: writing, visual art, and filmmaking. Lillian's creative life fairly divides into 20 years of filmmaking with J.P. Somersalter and 20 years of writing. Michael Moats was the sound engineer and technical advisor on their later films, and because of his expertise, soon the Somersalter Moats and Somersalter films and Somersalter Film Collection. I thought that was a comment about that. Controversial point I wasn't expecting. So the body of their work will soon be available on DVD, YouTube, and Vimeo for an entirely new generation and really a global audience to experience, which is exciting. The original film elements will be preserved at the Chicago Film Archive. Their body of work has received the Special Jury Award at the Chicago International Children's Film Festival and has had more than 40 other national and international festival showings and awards, more than I can name, and I know Lillian wouldn't even want me to. Woven through her filmmaking and writing is Lillian's painting and other fine artwork, which adorns her peaceful home and is evident in the amazing lithographs she created for her first book, The Gate of Dreams. In 2011, Lillian was given the American Friends Service Committee's Speaking Truth to Power Award for her activism in art and writing. I'll let her speak about her writing life tonight, but it is notable that leaders in their respective fields, such as Bruno Bettelheim, Robert Coles, and Howard Zinn, have each lent his support and praise for her writing. I met Lillian in 1993, in my first job out of college. I was the lifestyle reporter at Reporter Progress Newspapers, which many of you might remember was headquartered right here in Downers Grove on Warren Avenue. And one of my first assignments was to interview a local author who had just published her first book. So I grabbed my notepad and walked through town and showed up at the Little Brick Cottage on Maple Avenue, and I met Lillian. And I had slotted the usual 30 minutes for an interview time, and I think I left about 3 or 4 hours later. And those of you who know Lillian know how that's possible. 3 hours and now more than 20 years go quickly and in the most pleasant and inspiring way with Lillian. Looking back on that day, I realized what had drawn me in. I was just out of college and I had studied artists, but that day I had met a real one. So I'm pleased to introduce Lillian Moats.
Well, Pamela's a hard act to follow, actually. So, can people hear me in the back?
Yep.
Okay, great. Actually, Pamela started out as the lifestyle reporter, and her last full-time position was Vice President of Global Communications for the International Justice Mission. So it's been quite a journey. No indie author is really independent. Besides Pamela, I have leaned heavily on my family, Michael and Dave, on creative partner J.P. Somersalter, and other dear friends and colleagues. Without them, all of my writing would still be in my file cabinet. So welcome, everyone. It makes me very happy to see you here. Anderson's bookshops are a regional treasure, and this store in particular has befriended my writing since 1993. Later in the evening, I hope you'll wander these aisles, and while you mingle and enjoy the finger foods by Smoky Tomato, a true artisan caterer just around the corner. So I hope that they left some cards. I asked them to. If they're out there, do take one home. Hope A Myth Reawakened, this little book that you are helping me to launch into the world tonight, is short and suspenseful. At the end of my talk, I'll read from the opening of Hope, so as not to give too much away. I love this little book, and because I think it will be the last that I'll publish, I'm seeing this evening through a retrospective lens. I look forward to a future creating artist books, one-offs, or maybe a handful of copies. Many people have commented on how varied my books have been. Hope is the fifth. It's only recently that I've seen clearly that while they may be different in genre and subject, there is a personal through line connecting them. A hint of the next book was unknowingly planted in each. What I have to say about this through line will make more sense to you if I refer back to a period of my life which many of you know about or have read about in Legacy or Shadows. During the 5 years bridging my late 20s and early 30s, I suffered from a prolonged emotional fragmentation with terrifying symptoms and overwhelming, inexplicable guilt. Every day was an agonizing examination of my memory and the physical world around me for evidence of my imagined crimes. It was therapy that made me well, years and years of it, not writing. Writing was my effort to turn 5 years of needless suffering into art that might help others. But the subject of each book and my approach to it has been a measure of where I was emotionally in relation to that long trauma. My books have moved incrementally from a psychological focus to a philosophical one, as I felt more solid in self-knowledge and able to put my own story behind me to address broader issues. I'll take the books in order, set them in a personal context, and give you a bit of their flavor by reading a passage or two from each. I'll start with The Gate of Dreams, published in 1993. This book I illustrated primarily with silhouette, and but there are 6 color plates, and they usually elude me as I flip through like this. But at any rate, they were taken from my oil paintings. There's one. When I wrote and illustrated this collection of fairy tales, the symptoms of my illness were several years behind me. But I was in no way ready to write about it directly. While all fairy tales can be interpreted through a psychological lens, some of the personal symbolism in these stories was disguised in fairy tale garb even from myself. During the worst of my illness, my world constricted to the 2 rooms in which I felt the least fearful of myself: my therapist's office and my dining room. This is where I passed the time between appointments, sometimes by writing little stories on a notebook in my hand as I paced around the room. 2 of these, and one that occurred to me in a dream a few years after, comprise The Gate of Dreams. I'll put the passage I'm about to read in context. A gifted woodcarver is called to the castle to work for the queen. This widower takes his spirited little daughter with him. She learns to dance, and one day the woodcarver carves a beautiful statue of his daughter as a ballerina. The child's cruel governess tries to win the favor of the queen by presenting the statue to her as a gift. "It is extraordinary," the queen exclaimed, "utterly perfect." But the wise queen was not easily fooled by those who were bent on winning her favor. So she added, "It is really too perfect to be a portrait of the little girl I have come to love. And besides, the figure cannot move. How can it capture the spirit of a child who is movement itself? The governess was bitterly disappointed, for she had been certain she could impress the queen with such a priceless gift. And as she returned home, her heart blackened with spite. She pounded the little replica on the child's own bureau and laughed a cruel laugh. "There, see what you are not." She commanded the child to dance, but she could not, for her movements had become stiff and wooden. The governess badgered and belittled the little girl until, in fact, she did become ill, so ill that she lay quite motionless in her bed, day after day. Soon the girl no longer spoke at all. The woodcarver knew nothing of what the cruel governess was doing to his child, and the finest doctors could find neither cause nor cure for her ill health. She seemed always to be looking elsewhere, to be looking inward. In 1996, 3 years later, a paperback version of The Gate of Dreams was released. It's identical to the first edition, but the color plates were omitted. It was not until 1999, when I felt secure enough in my understanding of my own illness, that I was ready to publish Legacy of Shadows. I'll read from its preface. Now that I stand in this sunlit clearing, beyond a forest, menacing and deep, why do I want to take your hand and walk again through these woods? Perhaps because I've found they can only threaten me if I try to leave them behind forever. And while I have learned to travel alone from light into darkness and back again, it would be lovely to have a companion now and then. Skipping a paragraph or more. Eventually, I came to understand that my illness had not been mine alone, but the inexorable culmination of a story set in motion with the death of my grandmother's 2.5-year-old child 8 decades earlier. In exploring the particulars of my psychological history, I had awakened, ironically, to its universality. I realized that the severity of my symptoms cast in high relief a pervasive but elusive truth, that each of us is deeply directed by the legacy of unresolved emotion passed from generation to generation. Fictionalizing Legacy of Shadows and writing it in prose poetry seemed to give me the permission I needed to write about the lives of my grandmother, my mother, and myself. Here is part of the first journal entry as I imagined my grandmother's feelings. Lincolnshire, England, November 1904. The doctor's verdict has just been nailed outside our door. Whooping cough. I press my face against the glass to wail in silence. How can my child, who only 12 days past conjured a menagerie in my lap, who roared and trumpeted, snarled and purred, nuzzled to be petted, how can she now lie torpid in her bed, in terror of the next spasm? I rush back to her side. Oh, Anna, I am no child. Am I not 22, old enough to mother you, old enough to save you? Have I grown up only to grow powerless? Her disbelieving eyes engage mine with a plea. They cannot comprehend. I do not have the magic to transform her. My mother died 2 years before Legacy of Shadows was published. Shortly after her death, I learned to meditate. It was an extraordinary experience for me because my hands became very involved in leading me deeper into my early history. I've always had an unusual relationship with my hands, the depth and origins of which I had never really understood. Speak Hands, a meditation on memory and the unconscious, is the book that grew out of my meditation. To help me tell the story of this wordless experience, I used 4 voices, my own, one translating for each of my hands, and one representing what I call the hidden chronicler, that aspect of our consciousness I believe all of us possess, which continually narrates and continually revises the story of our lives. I set the stage for my experiences during meditation with this description of my relationship with my hands just before my emotional illness had struck. In 1973. I was 27 when this nightmare foreshadowed my impending emotional illness. At the stone fireplace of my basement studio, the mere touch of my index finger on the gas lever ignited a firestorm. I sat up in bed, aghast. By the next morning, I felt changed. I descended the stairs to the basement and stared at 3 gessoed panels on my drawing table. My concentration was deep as a trance as my left thumb flexed the springy tip of my palette knife. My right stroked the sable hairs of a brush. Without my conscious direction, my hands were determining what to paint. They began with the middle panel of a triptych. I was little more than avid observer watching them prepare. Then I go on to describe the process and point out the mysterious symbols in each panel. This is the arrangement of the panels in the original triptych, and then this is how we rearrange them for the cover of the book. Thanks to Dave. Day after day, I descended to the basement, fascinated to watch the painting progress. But when it was finished, I did not know what it meant. Rather, I did not realize that, bone deep, I knew what it meant. I stared and stared at my finished painting. My consciousness could not admit the message offered up to me by my own hands. Here was diagnosis and prescription, but I could not read them. Within days, I would be unable to hold my mind together any longer. In Speak Hands, I describe how, in 1997, during light meditative trances, my hands began to speak in gesture, without my conscious guidance. I don't view this experience as mystical or magical, but as a natural outgrowth of my psychological development. In fact, gesture precedes language for all of us in our earliest childhood. Linguistic psychologists find that even as adults, we often demonstrate with our gestures unconscious understanding of a concept before we can verbalize the idea. Many of the gestures that arose during my meditation referred to my early childhood. During the winters, when I was 2, 3, and 4 years old, I spent many days alone with my mother, keeping my vigil while she suffered through pneumonia. I was lonely and terrified of her dying. On the floor, with my legs tucked under me, I sat beside the couch where Mother slept between fits of coughing. As I fell into light trances, my hands would gesture, saying to me and for me things I hadn't the words or courage to say for fear of hurting my fragile mother. Behind the couch, there was a large picture window which separated inside from outside. My emotional internality from the world outside the window, where I longed to be. These recollections and reenactments, led by my hands, were culminating in 2001. At the time, my gestures were often focused on this remembered wall of glass behind my mother's couch. Just weeks after our son Dave had left home to go off to college, came the shock of 9/11. My reaction to the probability of war began to seep into my meditation and documentation of my gestures. I'll read from near the end of Speak Hands. Decades of war have been projected. Decades of war. I ask my heart's own questions. How many young people around the world, no less worthy and complex than Julian, will be killed or crippled? How many parents, no less devoted than Cameron and I, will have the marrow of their lives cut out? The imagined voices of my hands respond in unison. We rest in her lap for a moment before we feel another quickening of our fingers. Have we not expressed at last her longing to engage with the wider world, so stifled since childhood? Effortlessly, we rise again. With our flattened palms outward, we describe the picture window behind her mother's couch. We do not shatter, we do not crack. Instead, like sliding glass doors, we simply glide apart. This emotional change in perception, expressed bodily, marked my readiness to turn outward and leave my own story behind. I remembered my therapist's words: one can be open to the world when one no longer needs to attend perpetually to internal vigilance. Now the desire to understand what underlay the insanity of war, which afflicts the world so pitifully, seemed far more pressing and important than my personal story. Days after 9/11, I became engaged in the peace movement. There's nothing like having an 18-year-old son at the outbreak of a war to motivate you, along with Quaker values. I thought almost daily about why we make war. I was amazed at how many of my new notes piling up related to our exaggerated fear of death and the manipulation of that fear by powerful individuals and institutions. I had, of course, no credentials to write an academic treatment on this subject. But just as I had felt liberated to tell my family's story in Legacy of Shadows when I made it a fictionalized account, I felt liberated to write The Letter from Death as soon as I realized that only death would have the qualifications to write this book. My character of Death cares deeply about humanity, but is thoroughly fed up with how fearsomely she has been depicted throughout the histories of most cultures. Here is a short passage from The Letter from Death. Your fear and guilt have been exploited for centuries because of the mystery surrounding me. For my sake, as well as yours, I would have liked nothing better than to explode the myths. But with no words to utter, I could do nothing but appreciate your trustworthy doubts, which enabled you, if only for fleeting moments of relief, to laugh. This voice of mine, which still feels alien to me, must have been rising in me imperceptibly for ages, though it seems to have broken out abruptly. I did not know that accumulated frustration and anger could one day cause me to find a voice. Two things in particular made The Letter from Death especially gratifying to produce. Our son Dave illustrated it, both of us realizing that this might be a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to collaborate so closely. His satirical illustrations are powerful, as you can see here behind me. And after the book was finished, one of my heroes, Howard Zinn, lifelong peace and social justice activist and author of A People's History of the United States, wrote a wonderful foreword for it. Near the end of Death's letter is this statement. I have discovered from you that hope and faith can both grow out of longing. Hope does not require a leap away from careful observation of the world. Faith too often does. For that reason, I cannot claim I have faith in humanity, but only because I know so intimately your underlying yearnings, I do have hope for you. Why would I have written this otherwise? I didn't recognize at the time I wrote those lines that I was planting the seed for the next book, this last one, Hope, a Myth Reawakened. Was death expressing my own feelings? After delving so deeply into the subject of death and the violence provoked by fear of it, and after becoming increasingly aware of the violence we are doing to our planet, did I actually still have hope for humanity's future? This is from my preface to Hope. The ancient Greeks expressed the conundrum of hope in the multiple and contradictory myths of a fateful gift from the gods to the first humans. The gift was contained in a storage jar or urn. In the Pandora myth, it was translated as box centuries later. Did this gift from the gods contain evils as collective punishment or blessings? Who let the contents escape? The first woman, cunning and curious, or a foolish man? Hope is a central theme in these ancient myths, for in each rendition it is the only element not released from the jar. Scholars still debate whether hope's perpetual containment conveys optimism or pessimism. I approach this book as both a love story and a philosophical investigation. The ongoing mystery of who is narrating the story was intended to entice the reader along. I'll read only part of the first section to give you the flavor, and then leave you with the inevitable questions. Hope forlorn. Now that I've grown in understanding, I will tell you my mother's story. Hers was the longest solitary confinement in the history of the world. Held without charge, without recourse to any system of justice, still she could not die. Forlorn. How could she have been otherwise? Yet I cannot say my mother was without hope, for she is hope. She does not know whose hand pried off the lid, the roof of her prison, only to shut it before she could escape. You might guess Pandora believing Hesiod, but in another version it was a foolish man who opened the gift from the gods, a jar not full of Hesiod's plagues and demons, but of the finest qualities. They escaped into the world and disappeared, all except hope. We will never know whose hand it was that pried and shut the lid, for Mother tells me she saw only fingertips silhouetted against stunning light. She had never seen before, never been before, not as a separate self. The qualities had been but scattered elements of themselves, dispersed in the all in all contained in that jar. It was an all in all, teeming with untried energy, held in a fragile balance. She had never known this before. She had never had word thoughts before she coalesced into this unfamiliar form. Words were coming to her only singly, and she hardly knew what they meant, but she felt what they meant. Sifting, culling, shrinking, parting, becoming. What was this boundary of skin, these fingers? What was this face that she could not see but only feel with her fingers? What were these wings that she could move and that could move her? This metamorphosis could not have been happening to my mother alone, but who, she wondered, were these others? Hope, a Myth Reawakened, is an invitation to join me in an allegorical adventure, grappling with the age-old question that has taken on pressing relevance in our contemporary lives. Is there hope for the world? I'll leave you to follow the exploits of the main characters: hope, despair, wishful thinking, blind faith, and especially the one who remains nameless until she finds out who she is. Thank you.